August 1st, a massive tariff deadline is looming between the US and China, and we are wondering what will happen. We already seen copper tariffs being dropped to zero last night. So lots of turmoil in the markets, and we are really curious how that will play out. I've invited an absolute expert on US China relations, is Warwick Powell. He's an adjunct professor over at Queensland University, and we are going to explore that relationship between the US and China from a geopolitical, meaning military side, but also from a trade side, of course. We'll have to explore that. And if we have time at the end of the interview, I really want to ask him about also what is happening in the region. China, Japan, and South Korea are exploring a potential trade agreement as well. How much of a counterbalance is that to what's happening between the US and China? Lots to discuss, and something that we don't often cover here on this channel. So I'm hoping that's interesting to you because it brings a very new perspective. Before I switch over to my guest, hit that like and subscribe button. It helps us out tremendously, bringing phenomenal guests onto the program, and it's a free way to support us. Why wouldn't you do it? Thank you so much for doing that. Now, Warwick, it's a great pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure to be here, Kai.
Yeah, really looking forward to this conversation, as I said. Maybe we'll start with a very broad question. Like, what is the status of the U.S.-China relations right now?
Well, in many ways, it's a tense relationship because these two very, very large countries, arguably the two largest economies in the world and arguably also the two largest military powers in the world, are at loggerheads, both in terms of their bilateral relationship and also in terms of how they both view the long-run future configuration of world affairs. So it's quite clearly tense. Much of the tension, I think, emanates from a growing sense of displacement anxiety, as I'd call it, in relation to the attitudes and outlooks of those inside the Beltway in Washington. And I think we're going to be in for a difficult and challenging period for the next while yet, as the unfolding multipolarity, whatever that's going to look like, continues to unfold and find its way forward.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, like, the tariff trade relations are, of course, extremely tense and lots of back and forth. We've pretty much seen an embargo on trade earlier this year, back in April, where tariffs ran up to 150% on each side, and which was pretty much a trade embargo. Are tariffs just a new tool in the arsenal to sort of fight an economic war?
Well, clearly the introduction of tariffs as part of an important part of American public policy is a relatively recent phenomenon. Of course, tariffs were much more prominent some time ago, and I'm talking well before the Second World War, but in the post-war era, tariffs have tended to be used extremely sparingly, particularly by large advanced economies such as the United States. The fact that they have re-emerged as part of both economic policy and increasingly as part of geopolitical policy and strategy is a relatively new thing. Whether or not they will end up being able to deliver on the aspirations that have been heaped onto them, I think, is the other question. So the first question is what are the conditions that have given rise to this return to tariffs as the way forward? And the second question is whether or not they're likely to deliver on the expectations that have been heaped upon them. On the second question, I think the answer is actually much easier to arrive at, and that is tariffs won't do what people want them to do in terms of those advocating them. They're not going to deliver a return of manufacturing to the United States, but they are going to continue to hasten the decentering of the United States economy from the global system. That's not to say the US economy doesn't remain an important part of the world system, or in fact that it isn't connected to the world system. It's just that it's no longer going to occupy center stage. As to why there's been this retreat to very, very old tools such as tariffs, that's largely, I think, as I mentioned, partly a reaction to a sense of displacement, a belief that the economic model in the United States is not delivering on the promises of the American dream, and that somehow a rejuvenation of manufacturing, which is a very loose and broad idea, is somehow going to return America to a bygone era of greatness and prosperity. None of that is likely to happen.
Well, we've seen a lot of change and growth, of course, in China as well. Like, how much are they negotiating on an eye level? Like, where are they when you look at them in terms of negotiation, like prowess or like levels? Like, what's the terms? Like, who's holding the cards, right? Again, who's holding which card?
Look, my assessment has been from day one that America entered into this negotiations with a misconception that the United States held the cards, to use that sort of gaming analogy. And the reason I've said that from day one is that uh, any country that is a currency sovereign country can ultimately inject additional liquidity into its economic system to compensate for the loss of liquidity that comes from elsewhere. And the principal reason that China over the years has been an exporter to the United States is that, one, the United States has demand for goods made in China, many of which were originally manufactured by American firms that set up factories in China to sell back to the United States. And secondly, of course, from a high level strategic perspective, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, China needed US dollar currency as a means of payment to be able to access technologies and pay for technologies and many of the things that China itself didn't produce. China today is the world's only manufacturing superpower. It has a significant leading position, arguably a dominant position in just about every industrial category you can think of, and it is the only economic system in the world that has capability in every product category. So from a real economy point of view, China simply doesn't need the United States market. It can compensate for the loss of that market in two ways. One, through domestic liquidity expansion, which takes place via fiscal policy, particularly. And secondly, of course, the decentering of the US economy is taking place in large part because the growth of other markets in the world is happening faster than the rate of growth that we're seeing from the United States. So whatever is happening in the United States, the rest of the world market is simply getting bigger quicker. And if you're in the business of manufacturing things that countries want and need, or enterprises and households want and need, then there will be plenty of markets elsewhere in the world for those goods.
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic. I hinted at it earlier, and maybe we'll get to that right now as you bring that up. But it's really a local trade agreement that might be shaping up here between China, South Korea, and Japan as well. Maybe let's elaborate on that point. Like, how important of a counterweight is that, and how do you see that playing out, and where do they stand in terms of negotiations?
Look, this unfolding discussion between those three countries is part and parcel of a long-standing and periodic, a stop-start process of trying to arrive at a trilateral free trade agreement between China, Japan, and Korea. Now, that sits in the context of the geopolitical dynamics today, which I'll come back to in a moment. But it also sits against a backdrop of a whole range of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements that are already in place. Obviously, at the highest of levels, with the greatest footprint, is the World Trade Organization. And despite the many problems that the World Trade Organization has, most countries, and it has over 190 participating members, continue to undertake trade under the rules set by and agreed by the members of the World Trade Organization. So whilst it does have a lot of problems, it's important to not throw the institutional baby out with the bathwater. In the region itself, China is a member of a number of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements. Bilaterally, it has agreements, for example, with Australia, the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. It has direct trade agreements with ASEAN and individual countries in ASEAN. But more importantly now, I think, is what's known as the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This arrangement is a free trade arrangement that has been agreed by 15 nations, which is the 10 member states of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, together with Australia, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, Japan, and China. Now, amongst this group now, we are starting to see a dramatic expansion of intra-regional trade. And in fact, trade of each of these members constitutes over 50%, or trade amongst these members constitutes more than 50% of trade undertaken by these members themselves. ASEAN is China's biggest trading partner both ways as a group, and many of the countries in ASEAN is already China's largest trading partner, both import and export. So the contours of global trade have been changing now for 25 years. If you think back to 1990 or so, the United States occupied the pivotal position in global trade and investment networks. That's no longer the case. China is the major trading partner of over 140 nations in the world. And in the first half of this year, China's growth in terms of trade continued with over 190 nations in the world, right? Notwithstanding tariffs. So trade grew with everyone else bar the United States, more or less. So what's going on in Korea and Japan and China is against this backdrop. And the aim, in a sense, is to recognize that these three countries are geographical neighbors, which is an unavoidable reality. You know, you can't change that. And in fact, intimately economically intertwined through investment relationships, trade relationships, research and development relationships, people movement relationships. And what these countries are seeking to do is to consolidate these dynamics into a framework that provides long-term stability and confidence going forward. That this kind of arrangement might offset or be a counterbalance to whatever it is that the United States ends up doing is a bonus.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation because it really is being boiled up because of the relationship with South Korea and Japan. The U.S. has having military bases in both countries and having a bit of a military history with both countries here as well. So it's just an extra leverage point for China, because if they really want to just turn up the dial on the U.S., maybe they just intensify the conversations with South Korea and Japan as well. I see that as a bit of a leverage play as well, just to maybe eke on the U.S. to a degree as well. Say, hey, we can do business with your friends and allies here, and the U.S. is paying for all of that through the nose, having those bases there, guaranteeing security in a way. How do you see those relationships unfold? Is the U.S. exerting pressure on South Korea and Japan to sort of maybe break down the talks or at least stall them?
Well, there's no doubt that the US will continue to seek to exert pressure, particularly on its traditional allies. At the same time, of course, it's imposing tariffs in a unilateral way, which doesn't necessarily help it make friends. So I think the US has a at times contradictory approach to how it seeks to mobilize its allies and to consolidate these sorts of relationships. The other thing that I think is going on in the region, particularly in terms of the United States military footprint, is that whilst the United States historically has the overwhelming military presence in Asia, particularly through its network of bases in a number of countries and the presence of over 80,000 or so troops, its presence, its ability to project power into the Asia region is diminishing. It's diminishing in part because of China's own modernization and its military expansion. So diminution of American presence is a relative issue to start with. But the change in the relative balance of power in a military sense is also taking place because the American military itself is demonstrating a series of fragilities and limitations, and arguably also capability disconnects between the emerging realities of technical and warfare requirements. And we're seeing that in a few arenas. The United States, of course, as we know, has initiated on average 3.7 military interventions per year since 1991, which is actually more than it's ever done before. It is well practiced at utilizing kinetic means to exert pressure on others, to cause regime change, and to twist arms to get countries to behave in ways that are satisfactory to Washington's calculation of interests. But what we've now seen is an American military industrial system that has real limitations when confronted with the realities of contemporary warfare. Ukraine is the classic case in point, where the United States military might, so to speak, has underwritten the development of the Ukraine army over the course of the decade since the Maidan events in 2014, in the expectation that a NATO-trained, US and NATO-provisioned Ukrainian army would be more than a match for Russia. As things have been unfolding in Ukraine over the course of the last 3 years, we've seen that, in fact, that estimation has proven to be wrong. The expectations that various shipments of ever new wonder weapons from the West would somehow turn the tide of the conflict, that's also proven to be false. So the United States and the Western powers have been experiencing a slow but progressive and clear strategic defeat, which shows a few things. I mean, I'll leave the strategic stuff to one side. It shows, firstly, that American military hardware is not the undefeatable, top of the system. Secondly, it shows that the Western military machine simply doesn't have enough personnel, either because they literally are running out, or they're experiencing difficulties in recruiting and retaining personnel, but also that the West itself is highly reluctant, understandably so, to put its own people in harm's way fighting other people's wars. We also know that the Western doctrine, in terms of its thinking and methodology of warfighting, has been found wanting. And lastly, and most importantly, in my view, we can now see that the capacity for the Western industrial systems to repair, replace, and replenish lost materials is simply nowhere near the levels that are needed to replace what's lost in warfare, but also deal with the capabilities of those the West sees as its principal adversaries. We've seen, and I think this, and the last point I'll make here is that in the Middle East conflict, we've got two interesting things, and important, insightful things. One is that the attempts to bludgeon the Houthis out of their interventions in the Red Sea have failed, ultimately leading to a ceasefire agreement with the American battle cruisers leaving the region. And the second thing we learned is that the 12-day war in Israel depleted American ground-to-air defense systems to a point where its THAAD missiles, about 25% have been chewed up in 12 days. Is 25% of available inventory, possibly a little bit higher. And that's somewhere like 6 to 8 years worth of future production that's needed to even play catch up. So the United States military is simply nowhere near where arguably it once was. And indeed, in the Asia region now, it is slowly but surely, if only quietly, taking a backward step. So it's taking troops out of Okinawa, for example. It's largely been pushed out of the First Island Chain region, and it's rebuilding its network in the region via a series of minilateral agreements whereby its partners, whether they're former colonies, sub-imperial powers, or post-war client states, are now being pushed to the front. And so the United States game plan, even if its objectives haven't really changed, is to push others to the front, cause others to take the greater risks on the front line, whilst at the same time saying you can pay for the privileges of doing so.
Yeah, it's very interesting topics, and we could either go full circle back to the tariffs, actually, because you were talking about replenishing military equipment and supplies. It brings us to the supply chain, but I probably want to stay on the geopolitical side in the region, the Asian region, or the Oceanic region, maybe combine them as well, because you've been advocating or promoting like a local equivalent of NATO, more or less, like in the region, where the military, like Australia and other countries, sort of form a military alliance. Can you elaborate on your thinking there? And like, what do you mean? Is that even a possibility? How aligned is the thinking amongst the Asian nations with, if you throw in Australia and New Zealand here as well?
Well, let me make it clear, I haven't been promoting an Asian NATO. But the issue here is more about rethinking the ways in which an Asian security architecture can be crafted to reflect the realities of the 21st century, and also to change our thinking. So at the moment, much of the thinking revolves around this idea of how do we deter war, through strength, deterrence through strength and that sort of stuff, to a different set of questions, which is how do we create the institutions of peace in a way that recognizes the legitimate concerns and aspirations of all the countries of the region, and in doing so, thinks through the institutions of peace building that has at its very heart the idea of neutrality and indivisible security, meaning that the security of one can't come at the expense of the security of another. The other thing about this sense of positive peace is that security is not detached from the other considerations. So the proposition is that we can't think about this question of security in isolation from thinking about the questions of economic prosperity and regional stability. And these dimensions actually need to be brought together into a symbiotic and holistic approach to regional institution building and regional peacemaking. An American approach historically has been to divide and conquer, to create blocs, to arm one side so as to enable them to fight another side. Whereas I think an Asian sensibility, if you will, is going to demand a very different kind of approach. And in fact, it's going to be, I think, the kind of approaches that can be informed by the experiences of Asian nation states and civilizations and peoples that took place prior to the European colonialization period. So there was an Asia before the Europeans arrived at the end of the 1400s. And in a sense, I think there will be an Asia that is quite distinct from the experiences of the last 500 years that will emerge going forward.
No, it's an interesting topic. Lots going on, lots of moving pieces as well. Since I have you and we're both in Australia, I do have to ask you, what's the role of Australia in all of this? Because we have a bit of an Australian audience here as well. I'm curious, what are your thoughts? What should Australia's role be?
Look, it's a great question. And I think this is the debate that is really beginning to build up a head of steam in Australia. For 70 years or so, Australia has actually had a very simple way of approaching its role, and that is to be a sub-imperial backstop to the American empire within the region, for entirely understandable reasons. When Australia pivoted to the United States in 1941-42, away from the protective umbrella of the British Empire, it did so because the British Empire was collapsing, and out of sheer necessity and arguably desperation at the time, it turned to the United States. Ever since then, it has seen the United States as its unwavering security guarantor within the region, particularly through the instruments of treaties such as the ANZUS Alliance. That made things very easy. Whilst America had unquestioned primacy in the region and was able to project its power without any pushback from within the region, that posture from Australia was a simple one. The world, of course, has changed for the reasons that we've discussed already, which means that Australia is confronting a very different landscape now, and it's causing some anxieties amongst the foreign policy and security establishment. And you've got divergent views. One set of views more or less says, look, the American era in Asia, in terms of American primacy, is over. There's no going back, and Australia needs to prepare for a post-America future. That's one view. The other hand, we see people saying, look, Australia can't afford American diminution to accelerate, and in fact, Australia must do whatever it can to fall in behind American initiatives to hold its position in the region. And some even go so far as to argue that because Australia, in effect, provides the United States with facilities, the US in effect runs bases out of Australia, even if they aren't bases in formal terms. Australia really needs to be at the table insofar as being involved in joint war planning. So that's the other extreme of the argument. This debate is going to pivot around really two big questions. The first one is whether or not American primacy can be recovered, or whether, in fact, the decline of American primacy in the region can be stalled. So how you resolve that question is going to, in a sense, shape the possibilities that you can think about. The other one, of course, then comes to, well, if American primacy is waning, which it is, and in fact, I don't think that there's any debate in Australia that it is, really, at some point in time, Australia is going to need to think about what a post-America Australia looks like. And that means recalibrating its entire attitude towards the region. Now, Paul Keating, a former Prime Minister, used to say, and this is 30 years ago, that Australia needs to find its security in the region as opposed to from the region. And I think that issue is going to become unavoidable. Now, whether that is going to be an issue that Australia will arrive at a decision on its own rather quickly, I think is debatable and arguably unlikely. And in part because I think the Australian sensibility is to, in a sense, hope that the issues won't come up yet, kick the can down the road, to use an Australian phrase, and perhaps hope that changes in the world will make the decision for us. So if in the end, in 20 years' time, it is quite clear that American primacy is actually over, then Australia will just quietly, make some adjustments and approach the Asian era, with a new sense of commitment to the region. So that's where I think it's at. I'd like to see, if you sort of push me, I'd like to see in Australia think a lot harder about playing a constructive role in regional multipolar institution building, and get away from the idea that we need to participate in bloc politics, open the region up, build cross-pollinated institutional dependencies, expand dialogue, intensify trade and investment flows, and really integrate a sense of security in a narrow sense with a bigger vision of regional stability and prosperity.
No, Warwick, really appreciate your opinion on that, and I think our Australian audience appreciates that as well. I want to use the last 2 minutes to come full circle back to the U.S. China relations and the tariffs. The 90-day truce is ending August 12th. How do you see that playing out? How close are we to a deal? Let's find out what it means also for the investors.
Look, I think that there will be an extension. There won't be an agreement in the next 2 days or so. And so we're going to see the temporary status quo persist, and that is the status quo that was in place on what is in effect the 1st of April. The world changed a little bit in the week after, or 10 days afterwards, and then the temporary truce was arrived at and wound the clock back. That's where we're at. It's quite clear that the discussions that have taken place at the 3 meetings, including the one recently concluded in Sweden, addressing very difficult issues and quite clearly very different perspectives as to who should do what, who's responsible for what, and I don't see there being any quick resolution. There's certainly not going to be some big numbers that will enable a social media tweet announcing some grand bargain taking place in the next week, and it's not the way that China undertakes statecraft. And if we think about the idea that China, in fact, is relatively confident that it can weather the storm, which it has, and that it has the material capabilities within its own economic system to, in a sense, do what it wishes to do and progress its economic development with or without the United States being part of it, then China itself is in no hurry. And so it is going to address the issues in a typically Chinese way, which is thorough, unhurried, and ultimately, they'll reach a decision when they feel like that they need to reach a decision.
Fantastic. Warwick, really appreciate your time and conversation here. Really insightful, very different perspective on things. Where can we send our audience to follow more of your work?
People can find my work mainly or most easily at Substack. So Warwick Powell .substack.com, and there's plenty of stuff there covering all sorts of things. And if people find it interesting, then obviously, follow it and subscribe to it.
Fantastic. Warwick, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Really insightful. And everybody else, thanks so much for tuning in here to Soar Financially from the road in Australia, talking about from an Australian perspective, like what role should Australia have in the region? And of course, we had to dissect the U.S. China tariff relationship based on Warwick's excellent expertise in the field. So thank you so much for tuning in. Hit that like and subscribe button. It means a lot to us, and it's a free way to support us. Thank you so much. We'll be back with lots more. Take care out there.